Okay. All right. I think Chris's audio is still connecting. But we're going to go ahead and get started for the sake of time, and other people can join us a little bit later, or we can, I guess, see you guys on the recording side. Okay, but good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mudugbe, and this is African Fashion Weekly. We've put together this funding fashion conversation to really give you some access to the time and expertise of the wonderful Keitumetse Lekaba, who I'm going to introduce. She is also known as the business doctor, and she's the managing director of I Am an Entrepreneur. She uses years and years of experience in enterprise and supplier development programs to help SMMEs grow, and has experience as well in tax compliance and finance and SMME funding and strategy. She is also currently, along with this very busy role at I Am an Entrepreneur, doing her master's research, as she's an MBA candidate at Gibbs. She's a speaker, she is a masterclass host, she is a guest lecturer at the University of Joburg Center of Entrepreneurship. And we're just really excited to have her here to answer some of the questions that tend to come up in terms of the difficulties that fashion businesses have when it comes to funding. So welcome, Keitumetse. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure being here.
And thanks for giving us this hour of your time. I'm going to start with a few questions that kind of cover the overarching themes that I saw coming in the questions that people submitted at registration. And so the first one I'd like to chat to you about is, what are the main types of funding that are available to micro businesses and SMMEs, and what do those types of funding require from the people applying for them?
So the funding that is available out there there's three types, right? We have grant funding, loan funding, which is debt funding, and equity funding. And I'll go through all three. So with grant funding, that's money that does not have an expectation of a payback, but the payback obviously happens in other forms. So normally when you get the grant funding, then they give you certain KPIs and goals that you have to meet, and the certain things and targets that you would have to meet, and things to use the grant funding money on. And the biggest thing with grant funding, especially if it's coming from government institutions, is that you are able to use the grant funding to grow your business so that you are able to employ people, and that comes back into economy, because in employing people can participate in the economy and they can pay tax, and your business can grow, it can pay tax, and that's how the money flows back into the system from a grant funding perspective that's coming from a government. And obviously, if the grant funding is coming from corporate, it's also in the light that it will flow back into the economy one way or another, with your participation in economic activity. And then with debt funding, probably also one of the most difficult ones to achieve as a startup or a small business, because you would know that small businesses don't often have the history that is required. They don't have the security that is required when you're applying for debt funding. They generally just don't have certain compliance documents that is required for debt funding. So it becomes a little bit tricky to get debt funding as a startup if all your ducks are not in a row, because the expectation with debt funding is that you need to pay it back, and it is a consistent payback. So when you are looking for debt funding, you need to be able to make sure that you can pay back every month that debt, which means as a startup of an SMME, you also have pressure to make sure that every month you have consistent sales to be able to pay back the debt. Equity funding is a little bit different, because with equity funding, there's no expectation of payback, But obviously, the person that is giving you the equity funding is expecting your business to grow so that they can exit at a future date at a much higher rate than what they gave you. Normally, the rate can be anything between 18 and 24, 25% that they want to exit at. And they are vested with equity funding. The funder is vested in the growth of your company. So they also take shares in your company where they take a certain percentage and they help you grow through the years. And we see this happening a lot, especially with tech startups, where equity funders are comfortable giving tech startups equity funding because of the potential to scale their businesses to a certain level over a period of time.
All right, that's a great overview of the main three types. Thank you. So across these three types, the bodies that give out grant funding, which is usually government and similar organizations, the bodies that give out debt funding, and the bodies that give out equity funding. What gives these different types of funders pause? You talked a little bit about it in debt funding, that typically small businesses don't have enough of a history and they don't necessarily have all the compliance documentation that they need. With equity and grant funding, what tends to hold these businesses back?
With grant funding, it goes back to the scalability and the ability to employ. Because with grant funding, it needs to benefit beyond yourself. So the employment is quite a huge one. So if someone gives you grant funding, you need to at least employ one or two people or whatever the grant funding is used for. So the employment thing becomes quite a big one so that we can increase the participation of people in the economy. And even with grant funding, there are certain compliance elements that you need to adhere with, be it registration compliances, tax compliances, SARS, have business records. And a lot of the time, what really does trip small businesses is the tax compliance. Because I don't know, there's some perception that if you're small, you don't need to comply with tax, which is so incorrect. If compliance is done right from day one, you avoid it being a red tape in your business. And similar with debt funding, compliance is always an issue because of the tax. I got this from one of the commercial banks. It's called a HAS model, HAS.
Okay.
SMMEs often, what they don't record is that they don't have history. So you haven't recorded your history. A is for affordability, so which means you haven't done your assessments to be able to check whether or not you can be able to pay back this the loan that you are looking for. And especially if you're a startup, it's very difficult to do projections because the projections are done on assumption. And a lot of the times when you are going for debt funding, the person that's giving you the money wants to make sure that you will be able to pay back this money. So which takes us back to the third one, which is S, security. In the event that you can't pay me back, how are you going to pay me back? What are you putting against this business of yours? So that's with debt funding. I think the affordability is one of the biggest ones. And then with equity, equity has a lot to do with scalability and how you're going to grow your business. Because the funder wants to exit at a high rate at a future date in time, he's interested in the scalability. And so the markets become quite a huge one for entrepreneurs to understand, so that the projections are validated, and you can validate your scaling numbers based on whatever information you've validated it on. And also equity funders are quite big on the team. You hear the term funders back the jockey a lot. And because they invested in your business, they do look at who is behind the team. Because to them, I think it becomes quite important for equity funders to know that the people behind the business are, one, teachable, and two, they're able to take advice, especially when it comes to scaling, because we do tend to be a little bit protective of our businesses. Like, they are firstborn babies, so you don't want anyone else to touch it. So they are very technical about who is behind the backing the jockey, so who's behind the business. So that becomes quite important for those funders. I think, yeah, for the equity funders, definitely the team and the scalability of the business.
Okay. That's great to be able to kind of separate for people what the different types of funding or the different types of funders are, and what you'll need to be an attractive prospect to them. So I think this audience is fairly well versed in how to begin the search for grant funding, but a lot of people are a little bit lost in how to look for debt funding and in how to look for equity funding, and if there even is equity funding available for our types of businesses. I know that there are a couple of new businesses that kind of work all across the continent that are looking specifically at funding the creative industries. And those are great, but they've also got very stringent requirements where from where I'm sitting, I think it looks like really only luxury brands that are about 5 years old would appeal to those particular companies. So are there sources when it comes to equity and debt funding that even micro businesses can have access to that people don't know very well? Where should people start the search?
I think from a search perspective, and maybe let me start it from a South African context, right? And I'll start it from a government perspective. So in the perfect world, if our governments worked 100% perfectly, the funding starts from when you are youth. So there's what we call NYDA, the Youth Development Agency, that gives grants to micro and small businesses to help you start up. And genuinely, they're a bit lighter on requirements because they understand that you won't necessarily have, like, as a commercial funder would want, history and all those things, and you won't necessarily have a comprehensive business plan, a comprehensive strategy, but you have a business idea, and you probably have, if you are doing, for example, let's say you're doing laundry services, you've got a plan of where you're going to put this machinery. If you're applying for grant funding for machinery or whatever it is, if you're in the fashion business, you're looking for certain machinery or one machinery to start you off with so that you stop outsourcing certain of your services because it's expensive, so they understand those intricacies. So then they fund you to start up, right? And then once you've outgrown that youth thing, we have an organization called SEFA. And SEFA is the Small Enterprise Funding Association or Institute or whatnot. And with SEFA, they give loans or funding up to 5 million. And you don't get grants only. So once you've graduated there, SEFA gives a combination of loan and grant.
Okay.
Right? And these are typically also for startup businesses, early stage businesses. You've started something and now you really need to commercialize or go into market with a particular thing. Then the SEFA is meant for that. And then once your business has outgrown that and you need bigger machinery or whatever it is, bigger space, then you move on to NEF, National Empowerment Fund. And the NEF, I think, funds all the way up to 120 million or whatever it is, because they fund various industries, but they are more stringent because at the time that you are now coming to NEF, the expectation is that you would have crystallized your business model, you would have crystallized your business plan to a point where you are now eligible for this commercial funding, right? And then you do that. And then once you graduate from NEF, then you can do DTI, which is mostly obviously for industrial. And now this is where your product has potential for export and all of that stuff, and then they can support you through that process. So that's from a South African state landscape, how the funding works. And then if you're moving on to the commercial side, so now you're moving into private sectors. Often small businesses start with what we call enterprise and supply development funding. So this is funding from corporates. So in the South African laws, corporates need to spend a certain percentage of their income of their profits on developing SMMEs. So then you would associate or you would go to a corporate that is closely linked to your industry. So if you are in this fashion industry, you would go to a corporate like TFG, the True Words for Sheena Group, and try and get into their ESD program because that's a beneficial relationship for both of you. Because then you can also, at some point, once you've gone through that, if they have funded you or whatever they've done for you, you're a potential supplier for them as well, right? So it becomes difficult when you are looking for enterprise and supply development funds from a corporate that is not related to your industry. So if you are in fashion, it's going to be difficult for like a Coca-Cola, South Africa to fund you or even support you in any way because it's not linked to any of their programs or what they do.
Okay. So
And
the
in the
benefit for them is you potentially becoming a supplier. So it needs to be
correct,
relevant. Okay.
and they're growing the industries, right? So they're interested in the industry. So even if, let's say, for an example, if you are in logistics, if Coke supports you, even if they wouldn't have a contract for you at that point, but you would be able to probably go and secure yourself a contract with another corporate. And at the time that they do have the opportunity for you, they can call on you as well. But if you're in a different industry altogether that is not related to their business, they're never going to get a chance to call you. And where a lot of these corporates, and obviously from with with also just with ESD programs and ESD funding, the funding is obviously ring fenced to Black owned businesses because it comes from the BEE scorecard. So that's probably from a corporate perspective, or you can go to, there aren't quite a lot of those type of funders in the country because a lot of that just where you can just go to them for funding purposes that are not linked to ESD programs from a loan perspective or even from a grant perspective. But I know across the continent, we probably have a lot more of those. But from an equity perspective, you can approach any equity partner to take equity in your business if your industry is related to their mandate. Because even equity partners have mandates to say, we will only enter into transactions that are in these industries. So then you as the entrepreneur would need to research or you need to find out from those people before you even apply if your industry is part of their mandate so that you don't waste time putting in funding applications only to be told that your industry is not in their mandate. But you do have quite a lot of equity funders out in the market.
Yeah, I think the funding conversation, like across the board, has kind of been taken over by equity funders, funds or venture funding that's been put together, but is the kind that is mainly focused on tech as an industry for its scalability, and that becomes their mandate. So I think there's a difficulty in finding exactly who the partners will be. But yeah, it's a matter of exploration and research and just keep looking, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's also a challenge because let me tell you what the easy thing with tech is. The scalability of a tech product is easy.
Yeah, it's
Um,
not the same as a fashion product. It's so
it's not
labor intensive
exactly. So then you would
compared to
have
tech.
to, as a tech entrepreneur, you would have to really challenge yourself in terms of how do I scale my product fast to the right market, whether it is in the low end, whether you're selling to pyramid, to the lowest people in the pyramid, or whether you are doing luxury and high end. But the biggest challenge becomes when you are asked this one question: how are you going to scale? And how quickly are you going to scale? Because selling a product is a very difficult thing. A B2C business, and I always say this, a B2C business. So just for benefit of the people, you have B2B and B2C. So B2B is business to business, which means you're selling your product to other businesses, and chances are selling to other businesses means you're selling at bulk, or at least you're not selling one item, you're selling more than one item to the other business. And a B2C is a business to consumer business where you are selling one item to an individual, which then becomes very difficult to scale because now, if you are aiming at making 1 million rand a month, if your
Mhm.
product is 1 rand, you have to make sure that you get to 1 million people in that month. And where a lot of the people get it wrong is that we're not sure how to project where this market is coming from. Because what the people look for in that instance is that, you have three layers of a pyramid that I often teach. You have a market that is serviceable, you can service. So if we're looking at it from a South African perspective, you have a market of 60 million people in South Africa, but you have to break it down further. From the market, from your market of 60 million people, how many of those people can you actually can they buy from you, right? So your top layer is the target market, whatever it is, the 60 million. And then you have to break down the 60 million to the second layer, which is the people that you can service. So out of these 60 million people, how many people can afford my product? Now you start eliminating kids, what. And then you go deep, you go further, and then you go to another layer, that to the people that are reachable. How many people can you actually reach? Because if you are selling a tracksuit for 100 rand, trying to sell this tracksuit probably to someone in Limpopo for, now you must sell it for 180 to incorporate in your transport cost. But there's also someone in Limpopo selling the same tracksuit probably for like 100 rand. So when someone sitting in Limpopo has to decide, they're going to take the 100 rand and not the 180. Unless you've built a brand for yourself that people say, I'd rather go for that 181. And that is where people get it. That is where the homework becomes difficult. How many people can you service and how many people can you reach? And that speaks to how fast can you also scale.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as it's funding. Everybody's got a goal for funding. Funding is not charity. And with equity funding specifically, if they're going to give these large amounts of money, then it really just is about that timing and when everything's going to be paid back. So thank
Mm.
you so much for that. That was really detailed and I think has given a lot of, or will give a lot of people who watch this a great starting point. So my final opening question before we go to Sita and Chris for their questions, if they have any live to ask you. My final opening question is something that I heard you talk about at a Heavy Chef event where we met, where you were on a panel speaking about funding, and you made the point that I thought that was really important about people remembering to like keep sales as the focus and keep their design for revenue focused on the revenue coming from their sales. So when it comes to growing revenue, when it comes to like right at the beginning of a business, when you need to get from just surviving each day of business to actually starting to return a profit into the business, what principles should micro businesses and SMMEs focus on to grow revenue? And if you've got anything specifically that you know has worked in creative industries, that would be great to hear about.
I think one of my biggest ones is we need to learn to stop competing on price. Because what normally happens when in especially in this space, like people start competing on price and then they don't realize that you eat into your what we call the gross profit margin, and then your gross profit then cannot sustain the rest of your business expenses. So if you know an income statement, you have revenue right at the top, and then you have gross profit, which are all your costs that are related directly to getting your product ready. And then you have your gross profit margin, which is your profit that is directly linked to the product, right? Before you taking into account your business expenses. And then after that profit, you take all the other business expenses out, advertising, bank charges and all those things. So what often happens is that entrepreneurs play on price, and then they eat into that gross profit margin. So at the end of the month, when you're calculating your sales minus cost of sales, then the gross profit, what's left from that is unable to sustain the rest of your business because your gross profit margins are what needs to sustain the rest of the business. So if you have a product for 100 Rand, let's say you're selling your product 100 Rand, it costs you 50 Rand to make. And then your gross profit becomes 100 minus the 50, which is the 50. Now that 50 needs to be able to factor in your salary or other people's salary, any consulting fees, bank charges, whatever it is, marketing fees. But if you then start competing on price and then you decide, actually, let me sell this product at 80 Rand to beat my competitor, you then start selling your product at 80 Rand, it still costs you 50 Rand to make. So now your gross profit becomes 30 Rand. And then at the end of the day, you don't have enough money to sustain the business itself. And then you start putting out money from your own pocket or whatever it is. But in the long term, that does not become sustainable. And that's how businesses often fail, right? So also a very difficult thing to do, not competing on price. So you then have to distinguish yourself out in the market to say, what makes me different and how can I compete that I don't shortchange myself? So then what I often advise entrepreneurs to do is start at the bottom. Start with your business expenses and just say, how much do I need in a month? Just like you would in a household. For advertising, for marketing, accounting fees, salaries, whatever it is. What is that monthly amount that I need to make my business successful? And let's assume you come at 500 Rand just for ease of calculation. So that becomes 500 Rand. So then you know that whatever happens in life, and then you always need more than 500 Rand. And then you're going to say, okay, how much does it cost me? So which means then you know that your gross profit must always be 500 Rand. And that's where the calculation of your break even starts coming in. Then you start calculating what is the minimum amount that I can sell my product at to make sure that I can break even, which means I'm able to sustain the 500 Rand that I need every month. And then what you do to yourself is you never go below that, because once you start going below your break even point, then you start eating into your sustainability, which then threatens your continuation into the future. So with sales, you always need to make sure that your products and your services are priced right so that your business can be sustainable going forward.
Yeah, I think that cost is always the thing that trips people up, because in fashion we'll think of the cost of materials, but we'll not necessarily think of the operational costs.
Yeah, because you're just
You're trying
thinking it's
to
the
kind of make.
materials and you're forgetting that you're driving to get these materials, you're using fuel, you're using your car, you're not taking that into consideration, you're using electricity to make these garments. There's so much that you need to take into consideration to make sure that whatever is reflected in your income statement every month is a true reflection of what is happening in your business.
Yeah,
Even if you're using your child or your husband or your spouse to help you, that's someone working, which means that
yeah,
realistically, that's a wage. It's just you lucky to have the support to have your spouse or your family member helping you. But those are true costs that are happening in your business that you are lucky enough at that point to get them at zero. But those things need to be recorded so that going forward, you're planning, because the importance of numbers is in the planning, right?
yeah.
So if your numbers are incorrect, you're going to plan incorrectly and your decision making is going to be based on incorrect numbers. And often, and I know in this industry, a lot of creatives, they forget the numbers, and they forget that they are entrepreneurs and they forget that they are running businesses. They leave it as but we just creatives. But no, you're not just a creative. You're running a business, you're selling a product, you have
Yeah.
a customer, which means you must start thinking about the business side of it as well. Unless if you outsourcing that to someone else. But you need to start thinking about, am I compliant? Am I compliant with tax? Am I compliant with how am I running this business? Am I running it as a private company? Am I running it as a sole proprietor under my own name? Like what are the logistics to that? Do I
Yeah.
want it to continue beyond myself? So if anything happens to me, do I want the company to continue?
Mm.
There's so many things that even as a creative, you need to still consider.
Yeah, I think training for creatives tends to prepare us to be employees, but doesn't tend to prepare us to be entrepreneurs. And so you kind of have to learn all of this stuff on the job. But people are doing it every day and it's doable. And I think more creatives are realizing that and more creatives are interested in handling this properly because they do want it to be sustainable. They do want it to be a business that they can use to feed their families, a business that they can collect dividends from in the future.
Hmm.
So yeah, thank you so much for answering our opening questions. It's actually taken up most of our time, but I'd like to open now to Sita Solwazi.
I saw
She
someone on the chat.
Yes, so she's put her question in the chat, but Sita, if you wouldn't mind switching on your mic and giving a little context to your question and asking it directly, we'd love that. Sita runs a handbag brand called Sevens, really beautiful work. Sita, are you there?
I'm here.
There you are. Okay, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mudube, and thank you, Keitumetse, for your time today. Um, my question was around the funding available to South African creative businesses. My business was funded by angel investors, so basically like friends and family.
Yeah.
And I struggled to find platforms that I guess specifically focused on creative businesses. Are there any platforms that do support creative businesses financially and otherwise, I guess, in South Africa?
I was just saying, I think you might have missed it in the beginning, especially for creatives, it's in the South African context, it's easier to probably get funding from ESD programs, which are enterprise and supply development programs, which is funding that comes directly from corporates. But with this particular funding, it would really have to be with a corporate that is linked to your industry. Like I gave an example of Truids and Foschini Group. So in South Africa for BEE, all the corporates that are listed need to spend a percentage of profits on small businesses. And often part of the initiatives that they do is funding and coaching and mentorship. And I know like TFG has such programs and even Woolies has the programs. But back to what we said about the relationship, they often fund where there is potential for you to supply to them, right? And they support you so that the relationship can be a win-win. They capacitate you to be able to be a supplier for them, and then obviously moving forward, it becomes a win-win for in that instance. um and I think in the South African context also, getting a loan as a creative is very difficult. And getting debt funding as a creative is very difficult. And it goes back to what we were speaking about in the beginning. One, it becomes a compliance thing, right? A lot of creatives, when they start their businesses, they don't register for some reason. So then with that also comes the whole story about the history. Then you don't have enough information of history and how you started. And I often tell entrepreneurs that the history really just says, what have you done with the first rand that you took out to start your business? What has been that story? And unfortunately, with that story, it can't be a told story. If you're looking for funding, it has to be validated with data. And the data is often either in financial records that you've done over the years, or a bank statement. But because we are also not diligent in the use of our business bank statements, it becomes once again a red tape. And that's why I always encourage people, please start compliance from day one so that it doesn't become a red tape for you in the future. So if you have those things, then I think it becomes easier to get funding, even as a creative, because even if you walk into CIFA's doors, if you walk into NEF's doors, they're going to ask you the same question. What is your history and what have you done? Because they want to know what have you done with your first 50 Rand, 500 Rand, 50,000 Rand that you are going to do with our 5 million Rand.
Yeah. It's really important because they have to report well. They basically have to steward these funds well, and they have to report that they've been put in places where they were definitely going to make a difference, and not kind of just the money just kind of disappears into the air. Sita, I think with your business in particular, it's called Sevens. I think it's sevens.co is the URL. Do check it out. With yours, it would be, I think, a little bit of what Keitumetse mentioned right at the beginning of the call, which I think you missed. The National Youth Development Agency would be a place to start. And then when you've outgrown kind of their kind of grants and kind of funding that they can offer, you move up to CIFA. And from CIFA, you would move up to NEF. And from NEF, for industry, for industrial funding specifically, you'd move up to the DTI. But yeah, those are all things that we will explore in future conversations with African Fashion Weekly. And
what's the business called?
Pardon?
What's the business called? Sevens.
The
Oh, the
seventh
Sevens
store
store.
dot
I see.
co. Yeah.
And I
It's
think that's one of the biggest things. It's really just around your story and telling your story in numbers and validating those numbers. Because if you don't have that, and it's not unique to creatives, it's any business. It's difficult then to get the funding because like the likes of the CIFA and them, they do have funding for textile industries and
yeah. I think also there are basically we need to look into the government ministries that overlook things like our industry. There are funding parts of, for example, the Departments of Arts and Culture. They've got mandates, they've got money that they need to spend specifically on arts and culture. So we kind of need to know what parts of government govern what we do and are designed or exist to help us build these businesses and then kind of go from there. Christopher Tom, do you have a question? Christopher is a clothing designer with some really beautiful work as well, like layered denim.
and I see you are in the
Go
Sevens store. Sorry to cut you there, Mudubi.
ahead.
And because it's a luxury product,
Yes.
it goes back to that thing of proving scale. If you're going to sell, let's say, 50 bags in a month, who are you selling these bags to? And I know in those industries, particularly the biggest thing to prove is that because someone doesn't buy a bag every month, it's proving where the market is coming from every month to buy the bags.
Yeah. You've already got a little bit of that data, Sita, I hope. She sold out one of her first styles already, and this business has just launched. So that's pretty big, that's pretty cool. Christopher Tom, are you there?
Hi, Matupe. Hi, guys. I'm here.
Hi. Do you have a question specifically for Keitumetse? Hello?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was still on mute. I had a question, but she already answered it, which the question would have been, what do a business, my size of a business, would need to do to be more of a likely candidate to be funded in these in these institutions? But she already answered that history, which is really a good point that I picked up from what she had said.
Great, thank you, Chris. So I think I'll return to just a couple of prepared questions as we wrap up. These were a few more direct questions that I picked out that weren't repeated across what everyone registered with, but I did think they were interesting. Holofelang asked about collecting overdue sales without losing customers. And I picked this one out because of what you had said at that event about
Yeah.
focusing on sales as your main source of revenue. So I thought this was more of an operational challenge,
What?
but I
Just
wondered if you
repeat the
could
question. I missed the beginning of the question.
how do I collect overdue sales without losing my customers?
How do you collect overdue sales without losing your customers?
So this is a context. I'd love for Holofelang to be on the call to kind of explain the question a little bit more, but I think this is a case of having sold some
Debt.
product or services on
You're
credit.
selling on debt, yeah.
Yeah,
And I think you have to
needing them
be,
to finish paying.
from a debt operational perspective, you have to be strict about it. You almost have to be like, you have to be like a corporate about it. If someone owes you money, I know we, as entrepreneurs, we often skate to phone and say, "Hi, it's the 5th of the month. You said you're paying me today. Where's the money?" You really just have to be strict with the money, and you also can't. I hope she's also not doing business on gentleman's hand. If you are selling goods on credit, you have to have a contract that, even if it's a one-pager contract, terms and conditions that you sign with your customers, to say these are the repercussions if you don't pay me, and these are the dates that you've agreed to pay me on. There's a lot more admin involved in selling goods on credit to customers. But then if you have the stuff on contract and you've both signed on it, then you can follow up based on what has been agreed on the contract. But if a gentleman's hand, it becomes difficult. It's a relationship thing. Then the person is saying how now you don't trust me anymore. It's just, it doesn't work.
Yeah,
So I think business goes beyond the heart. You have to. It's also a paper thing,
yeah.
especially where you start doing contractual things like selling on credit.
Yeah. I think also with fashion businesses in particular, it just makes sense. I'm in a service business and it makes sense for me, but in fashion product businesses, just makes sense to demand a deposit before any work begins. Set up a deposit percentage. Maybe it's 40% of the full price that you know you'll need to get started, to cover materials, to cover operations and things like that. Maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 60%, but always start with a deposit so that you don't completely lose out if collecting the rest of the payment becomes difficult.
And use other models. You can use a lay-by model. Like, there's different models that you can use to make sure that the client gets the goods once payment has been received.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll take one more of the direct questions here. It says, how do you calculate the value of your intellectual property in a business and charge accordingly? And this question came from Dr. Erica de Grief. She's the co-founder of the African Fashion Research Institute. So a lot of what they do is research work, research hours, that then culminates in a report of some kind, and they're able to, I guess, try and sell that information or license that information. And I think that would be where her question on intellectual property comes from.
Sure. The intellectual property thing is a difficult one because there's currently a
Better answered
debate.
by like an IP lawyer, but yeah,
Yeah, there's
anything
currently a
else?
debate that says no idea is new in the market, right? So if you are selling handbags and then tomorrow I decide to go and do the same business that Sita is doing, I mean, she can claim that as her IP, but there's luxury handbags elsewhere. It's not a new thing. So I'm not sure what they're doing in the research, and what they are researching. But if you are researching whatever you are researching and you don't want anyone to get hold of it or use it, I don't know how you're going to protect that.
Yeah, I think with reports and with research, usually you can submit to journals that offer peer reviews. And if it's peer reviewed and published in that journal, then it's almost a stamp saying we are the first people to have asked this question this way and found these particular answers that are of value to this community. And then from there, I think that is something that you can then talk to commercial enterprises that might have a business application for your research. And charge accordingly. But yeah, intellectual property
But
is
to charge for research is a very tricky business to be
yeah,
in.
it's to get research funded, I think is usually the more challenging thing because it requires so much time. It's a full-time job and no one kind of is interested in paying for it upfront at the beginning.
Yeah.
So
You,
I'm
I
interested
think
in paying for research no matter what the results are.
she would have to probably partner there with organizations that want the particular research that she's doing. So if I'm in an SMME space and I'm trying to get research on, let's say, township SMMEs or whatever it is, I mean, my first point of call is to go onto the internet. There's so many that I can actually get that people have done before. And if I use it in a speech or whatever it is, I'm also not going to academically reference it to say, Christopher et al. Tom and Associates said this. I'm just going to say in a research that I read. So you can, if you're a researcher, you can charge for your time because also you can charge for the service of researching. But I don't think you can. It's difficult to charge for a document of research.
Yeah.
It would have to be a
Then,
service time,
yeah.
like how accountants do. If you're auditing, you're not charging for the financial statements, but you're charging for the work that goes into preparing and getting the financial statements ready. So it's a time thing. So you charge a time to the team. You also can't charge knowledge of IP. I don't know. It's quite
Yeah.
tricky.
It is tricky. I do think that one monetization channel, I guess, for research and for intellectual property is turning what you know into keynotes, into workshops, into services basically that people can pay for. So they pay for you to come and speak from what you know, or they pay for you to teach it to people. Yeah, I think that seems like a way to monetize intellectual property without having to protect the intellectual property or really calculate its value as a single unit of anything. That's the really tricky thing about intellectual property. How do you make a unit of it and say this unit of intellectual property is worth X amount? Yeah, so I think that is everything. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks Sita, thanks Chris. And thank you so much Keitumetse for all the knowledge that you've shared. I'm going to dive right into the kind of pipeline that you gave us in terms of looking for grants and looking for funding and see if I can kind of make a resource map that's going to be super easy for people to follow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for
And
your
also
time.
check out because sometimes also when people go to these institutions, because you are a creative, you're also not sure on you're not specific about which fund you're applying for, right? Because I know even wherever you go, you must say, I'm applying for this particular block, this textile industry, this whatever industry. So that it's not a blanket application.
Okay, so get to know the sources of funding, get to know what categories they are interested in, and get to know which category you fall into.
Yeah, so that it's not a blanket application, and you can really also make sure that you've done your homework knowing that, okay, I'm applying for this particular category, so that even when the funder receives your application, it's also not going to a blanket category of funding applications that are never looked at.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much. This recording will be available for everyone who registered for the chat. I will see about making it more widely available a little bit later. But yes, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again, Keitumetse, for your time and for your expertise. Thank you for sharing so much with us, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Mudupe.